Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. Right now, St. Louis is at a crossroads. It is facing all different sorts of overlapping crises around policing, around incarceration, housing, and the economy. And its current mayor, Lyda Krewson, has decided not to seek a second term in office. Now, Krewson's tenure has been particularly harmful to vulnerable communities in St. Louis. She has refused to close the Workhouse, which is a decrepit prison that is filled with mold and roaches. And most of the people who are there haven't been convicted of a crime. They're innocent in the eyes of the law. Yet she has still refused to close this decrepit prison. Krewson has also torn down encampments that are occupied by people who are experiencing homelessness in the area. But in April, the people of St. Louis will have an opportunity to elect a mayor who can address the issues that keep everyday people in St. Louis up at night. Now, there are 4 candidates running for this seat, 2 who will advance to the general election next week when St. Louis holds its nonpartisan primary election. And today, we are going to be chatting with one of them, current City Treasurer Tishaura Jones. We are so happy to have you here today. Let's jump right in. So, great to have you. Treasurer Jones, you first ran for this position 4 years ago and came within 879 votes of winning. And now you're doing it again. So talk to us a little bit about what was your vision then, what is it now, and how has it changed?
My vision then in 2017 when I ran was that St. Louis needs to change, and not just incremental change, but transformational change. And honestly, that is still my vision this time around in 2021. But we added to that, a premise that you should be able to succeed here regardless of your skin color, who you love, how you worship, your zip code, or any identity you hold. We need to make a St. Louis where everyone feels welcome, and that we address.
I'm going to let you repeat the latter half of your answer because I think we had some audio issues. So feel free to repeat your answer.
Changed over the last 4 years. When I ran in 2017, I said that St. Louis needed to change, and not just incremental change, but real transformational change. And in 2021, I'm still running on St. Louis needs to change, but we're adding to that you should be able to succeed here regardless of your skin color, who you love, how you worship, your zip code, or any identity you hold. St. Louis needs to be a place where everyone feels welcome.
And we've seen particularly how when it comes to policing, that is a place where a lot of folks see significant disparities based on their identity. And you've mentioned before that when thinking about how to reform the police department, you want to look to other places to see how they've done that and how you can mimic that here. So I want to really drill down on sort of some of the ways that other places have done this and where you can replicate this here. So specifically, I want to start off by talking about traffic stops. So over the course of the past year, we've seen cities shift the way that they enforce violations of traffic stops. So for example, failure to use a turn signal or a broken tail light. So as mayor, would you support replacing armed police officers with civilian traffic enforcement for these sorts of simple stops?
Yes, I would absolutely investigate that. There are, traffic stops and several other things within the police department I think can be handled by civilians. A recent report commissioned by one of our local economic development agencies talked about other things in the departments that can be handled by civilians. So we need to be asking the question, how big does our department need to be? How many uniformed officers do we really need? And what jobs can be handled by civilians? And what other professionals can we bring into the department so police aren't the only answer when you dial 911?
And I'm really glad that you brought that up about professionals answering 911 calls, because that's something that we've seen modeled in other places. So for example, we've seen how in places like Eugene, Oregon, where the cahoots model originated, and places like Austin, Texas, where police officers are not part of the process at all. And you have trained experts in mental health, for example, who they respond alone. And so the idea of this is twofold, which I'm sure you know, that one, the presence of an armed officer often makes things worse. They come and they escalate the situation, and it often results in more violence. And then the second part is it's simply wasteful. Police officers might be better suited to, or would definitely be better suited to spend their time doing things like solving homicides. And so circling back to St. Louis, in St. Louis, as you know, the Cops and Clinician Program sends clinical specialists who also respond to designated calls for service, but alongside police officers. So do you support a model where, let's take out the alongside police officers, where it's the medical expert, for example, and not the police officer who is the person who is responding and leading the answer to the call?
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad to see the Cops and Clinicians program start. However, that's one of the things I've been advocating for since 2017. Just last night, I was part of a forum in one of the local neighborhoods where they talked about, or they asked the question, will you commit to filling all 157 openings in the police department with licensed officers? And I pushed back and I said, no, because police don't need to be the only answer when we dial 911. And when we look at cities our size, similarly sized to St. Louis, we have more police than 9 other cities, the exact same size population. And these are cities like Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. So, there's something going on, as far as the size. And, a lot of people are pushing back saying, well, she wants to defund the police. I'm like, no, we need to reimagine and transform public safety in a way that keeps people safe in their homes and in their neighborhoods. Because I also offered another piece of evidence to this particular group saying that St. Louis also leads the nation in police-involved shootings per capita. So something has to change. We cannot keep throwing money at the same old arrest and incarcerate model and expecting a different result. That's the definition of insanity.
Yeah, and we see how in some cities that have these sort of mental health first responder programs that, there are some mental health there are some cities who have this who say that it can mean a 25 to 30% of emergency calls could potentially be rerouted away from law enforcement. So you talk about sort of diminishing the scope of the police department. What percentage of calls do you think should not be handled by them? Is it 20, 70% more?
Well, there was a pilot of Cops and Clinicians in one of our North Patrol districts, and that pilot indicated that almost 50% of calls could be answered by someone other than police. And I think research across the country shows the numbers hovering between 20 to 40%. If 20 to 40% of the calls that police typically respond to, all of a sudden they're not responding to, that frees them up to do police involved work. Like when we talked about investigations, solving violent murders, because right now our solvents rate, our rate for solving crime is really low, and it's lower than the rest of the country. So how can we free police up to do police involved work? And then how can we also deploy the right professional to the right call?
It's kind of like you're reading my mind, because that's what I want to talk about in the next question, which is the ability of police to actually solve things like homicides. So last year, St. Louis endured 262 homicides. And while the police department had a clearance rate of 25%, which is, as you know, well below the national average and around 20% lower than Kansas City. And so as the mayor, and as someone who's now the treasurer, you are someone who, as mayor, will have the bottom line responsibility for the safety of the people of St. Louis. So tell us what it says about the city's budget priorities and its safety priorities when the police department keeps getting a greater number of the city, or greater percentage of the city budget every year, but fails to solve 75% or more of its murders.
Well, it says that we're not a poor city, but we are a cheap city because we refuse to invest in the things that will move our city forward. And one of the things that will move the city forward, obviously, is repairing the relationship between public safety and the community. It's obvious that people will not come forward with the information that they have on these violent crimes because they don't trust the system. So how do we work with to transform our public safety department where people rebuild the trust that in that department, and then also feel safe coming to either the police department or to the circuit attorney's office to come forward with that information? Because right now the trust factor is gone, and we have to rebuild that by responding differently to their calls.
It's hearing you talk about public safety and how folks don't feel like they have trust in the institutions that are supposed to bring them this sort of public safety. Another model that so many cities have looked towards is cure violence. And St. Louis is starting to do that as well. We see that St. Louis has brought the cure violence model to the city. It's community-led, designed to interrupt and prevent violence before it happens, and sort of creates that trust because it's often peers. And studies show that the reason these programs work is because gun violence often spreads through these cycles of retaliation, hurt people hurting people. And so St. Louis has cure violence, but they've limited it to 3 neighborhoods. And as you said, St. Louis is not a poor city. So that could be changed. So as mayor, would you support shifting money from the police budget to fully fund that model?
I would support funding models like cure violence and also bringing in focused deterrence. I think we need to use all of the tools to interrupt violence and put them on the table because again, this funding the arrest and incarcerate model is not working, and it does nothing to repair the trust that we need with the community. So how can we bring more tools to the table to interrupt violence? And to bring our gun violence down. I also am in. I also want to declare gun violence as a public health crisis, so that brings everybody to the table to make sure that our flagship universities, our prosecutors, our faith community, our civic, our business leaders, and we have to have a regional approach because our crime just doesn't stop at the borders where St. Louis City ends on the west and on the east. We have to bring everybody to the table because it's a regional issue and it affects our reputation as a region. As people from the outside look at St. Louis and they think of us as one of the most violent cities in the country, and people don't care that not everybody lives in the city and people live in the suburbs. If you live in the suburbs in St. Louis and you travel somewhere else, people only know you from being from St. Louis. So how can we attack our problems as a region? Because if the city fails, the rest of the region fails.
Now, you've said multiple times that something that's important to you is you simply just want to make the city safer for everyone, and you want to give people the resources that they need to make themselves feel safe. And part of that involves not getting rid of law enforcement, but making it so that law enforcement is more effective. But in any event, as anybody who has ever pushed back against law enforcement, this sort of shift of resources away from police departments often attracts controversy, resistance, especially from law enforcement and their allies, even when it means that really you're just trying to make them more efficient and make their jobs easier. So how do you plan to manage your relationship with the police department and push back against that sort of criticism that they are, quite frankly, likely to lodge at you?
Well, I've talked to several friends that, and I do consider them friends that are current police officers, and they also agree that the current system just isn't working, and they have to try something different. So we just have to keep pushing back and asking, like my son used to when he was 4, but why? if we have to keep pushing back and asking why, why are we doing this? Why? And I think that once we these are going to be hard conversations. This is not going to be easy, and I don't think that it's going to be easy. But I think that we're going to be better on the other side after we push forward and make these drastic changes. It happened the same when I was in the treasurer's office. I had to make a lot of drastic changes in order to improve our services, and we're better off, 8 years later because of the changes that we made.
And we also see that a lot of national advocacy groups are pushing candidates for office at all levels of government to reject contributions from police unions, precisely because the sorts of agendas that they tend to push, and to give back any donations received from a police union. Now, you have said that you are going to experience a good amount of push, that you are familiar with dealing with all the pushback from law enforcement. Do you plan to decline or return donations tied to law enforcement unions, associations, or political action committees?
To my knowledge, I haven't received any donations tied to law enforcement or political action or their political action committees. And I did not even seek the endorsement of the St. Louis Police Officers Association.
Okay, so a related problem is private companies that profit from mass incarceration and the suffering that it inflicts on people and communities in St. Louis. Are you also declining, or if you have, returned contributions tied to the bail bond industry, private prison and probation industries, or groups that sell weapons or military gears to police departments?
Again, I'm not aware of any contributions that I've received related to the industries that you mentioned.
Got it. Okay. So these sound like guesses. So let's talk about the Workhouse, and that's the city jail that's been called unspeakably hellish. Mold, roaches, falling apart altogether. And you have supported closing it down, which is a top demand for the next mayor from the community members in St. Louis. So talk to us a little bit more about what you're hearing from people on the inside, and explain how that informs your plan to close that facility.
So what I'm hearing from people on the inside, not just at the Workhouse, but also at our jail downtown, which recently experienced a riot just a few weeks ago, is that people aren't being treated with dignity and respect. And so I firmly believe that if we have people that we are holding pre-trial, they should be treated with dignity and respect. And since they are not, that's why we saw riots in our jail just a few weeks ago. There are also other problems there, like the locks weren't working, and if the locks aren't working, that's not much of a jail now, is it? Also, the toilets weren't working. There was no running water, and that's not a condition that anybody should be in. And so my job as mayor is to, number one, fix up the facility downtown. I think we should be a one jail city, and make sure that that the people that are responsible for taking care of our detainees are trained and paid well, and again, that they're being treated with dignity and respect. Because we have a jail just several miles down the road in St. Louis County, and they had a chess tournament over the weekend. They had a Super Bowl party with White Castles brought in, and we haven't seen any riots there. So it's all about how you treat people, and we also need to work with our circuit attorney and our court system to make sure that we are moving people through the system as fast as we can. So they can either be tried and found innocent and go home to their families, and then help them not to get back into recidivize, or that they can, get on, make sure that they're moving them on to wherever their permanent place of detention will be. But I see our jails as not a place where we can just punish we need to make sure that we're doing what we can to rehabilitate them while they're in our care.
So what are the biggest obstacles to closing the workhouse? Who's opposing this and why?
Well, right now, the biggest obstacle to closing it is our other jail now has problems that need to be fixed. So my job as mayor is to first fix the problems in the jail that we do have, and then also work with our circuit attorney to triage the people that we're currently holding and determine really who needs to be there. Is it someone there for a nonviolent parole violation? Then obviously, how can we put them in a diversion program or get them the services that they need so they don't come back? And so once we take care of that, then I think we can combine the number of prisoners we have and put them all in one facility and close the workhouse for good, hopefully.
So let me nail you down on a timeline for this. What's the absolute last timing for shutting down the workhouse? When can this all get done by, and when are you hoping to get that done?
Well, I'm hoping that it'll happen in the first 100 days, but I don't know the condition of the city jail. I don't know how bad things are. And so, even though I'm hopeful that it'll happen in the first 100 days, I would say don't hold me to that, because I also want to be transparent. As soon as we find out what the problems are, we'll let everybody know what the problems are, and then set a timeline to possibly, or not to possibly, then we'll set a timeline to close the workhouse. But it's definitely going to happen in the first year of my first year of office.
Okay, so let's shift to housing. So the St. Louis Dispatch ran a story that noted that there have been 5,000 evictions since March, or eviction filings since March of 2020. And that means that once the eviction moratorium ends, there's likely to be a tidal wave of people who will be losing their jobs all across St. Louis. And one research quote in the Dispatch article says it's, quote, the worst thing we've ever seen. And so if I understand correctly, St. Louis's eviction moratorium is set to expire on March 1st, which is just a few days from now. So can you tell us a little bit about what has already been done to provide for people who will soon face the prospect of losing their housing, and what more you plan to do for those folks if you're elected?
So far, what I know is that we have provided millions of dollars to families in the form of rent and mortgage relief, and there's still a waiting list to access that money. Also in play is the current aid package that Congress is currently debating, where St. Louis stands to get upwards of $400 million. So we'll have to invest a big chunk of that also into rent relief if we get it. I don't know when that'll be. But I also understand that that the moratorium has been extended on the federal level until June 1st. And so in my opinion, that supersedes our local order of March 1st.
So I know I said we were switching to housing, but I want to go back to this workhouse question real quick because something just came up. So you've talked a lot about getting people out of the workhouse who don't need to be there. And one example you used of that is people who are facing nonviolent parole violations. But I do want to talk about the pretrial population in general there, because we know that most of the folks who are in the workhouse are there pretrial. So do you support certain measures to get folks out pretrial? So for example, do you support ending cash bail? And if not, what are you looking towards to see which people need to get released from that jail?
Absolutely, I support ending cash bail. But I want to make sure that the people that are there for violent offenses. I think if it's definitely something violent where someone has taken someone else's life, then obviously that they're a danger to society and should not be out. And only the circuit attorney and the police know who's there and who's there for what. So we should work with those offices because they're the experts here. to make sure that they can effectively triage who can be let out for not being able to afford bail, obviously, and who needs to stay behind bars because the offense was just so violent, and they are a danger to themselves or other people.
Thank you for bearing with me as I hop around on topics here. So let's go back to housing. So one concrete program that cities across the country are enacting right now is a right to counsel for people who are facing an eviction. And that's happened in Cleveland to New York City. And it's resulted in some massive drops, over 90% in evictions for people who are represented in eviction proceedings. Is that something that you would support both establishing and funding if you were mayor?
We have some great organizations that have been representing our people who have found themselves in the unfortunate position of being evicted, like Legal Services of Eastern Missouri and Arch City Defenders. But I think that's definitely something we should look into. Because a lot of times people just don't know what their rights are when it comes to being evicted or just being a tenant, period. So I would definitely support that, as well as a tenant bill of rights, to make sure that that everybody knows what their expectations are, and that people are protected as they rent from apartments, because over 50% of people in St. Louis actually rent instead of own homes.
So something I mentioned a little bit earlier was how the current mayor has been taking down encampments of people who are experiencing homelessness in St. Louis. And we know how damaging this is, how the CDC has issued guidance saying that this shouldn't be happening because it could lead to a community spread of COVID-19. So if you were the mayor today, I have two questions. So the first question is, if you were mayor today, would you support a temporary ban on sweeping of encampments of people who are experiencing homelessness for the duration of the pandemic? And the second part of the question is, would you support making that ban permanent?
I would absolutely support not evicting people from homeless encampments. But one thing that St. Louis did back in 2017, which is the reason why we have them in the first place, is that we shut down our only low barrier shelter, which was the New Life Evangelistic Center, and we did not replace it with another low barrier shelter. So we need to work with our advocates and our organizations that provide services for the unhoused on how we can establish not only one but several low barrier shelters across the region, because homelessness just does not happen in St. Louis City alone. And so how do we provide services for our unhoused in multiple places around the region, and also making sure that we have low barrier shelters for people who just need to come in and maybe wash their clothes, and don't want to be housed, but just want to be in a low barrier shelter. We don't do a good job of providing for our unhoused, period, and especially if we don't have access to low barrier shelters.
And just to clarify, so you would also support, when you were mayor, making the ban on law enforcement and clearing out these encampments permanent?
Yes, I mean, we would definitely have to look into it. But again, I want to make sure that there are other places for them to go, that they don't have to use an encampment in the first place.
One option that we've seen for alternative places to go, that other cities have implemented, for example, Austin, Texas, is purchasing underutilized hotels and other occupied buildings. Is that something that you would be supportive of doing as mayor?
Yes, absolutely. And we have a tiny home village that the current mayor started, but the barriers to entry are so high that it sits almost empty right now. So how can we take that existing village and maybe lower some of the barriers to entry, and that'll help our unhoused as well.
Okay. So last question. What is one specific thing? Actually, if you can stay a little bit longer, I have so many more questions for you, if that is all right. I know this is a 30-minute segment, but
okay.
So there are a lot of families in St. Louis who are struggling to pay their rent, put food on the table, and find work. So what opportunities has the current mayor missed for providing economic security to everyday people in St. Louis? And what would you do within your first 100 days of becoming mayor to start to build a better economic foundation for St. Louis and its residents?
So I live in a part of town called North St. Louis, and North St. Louis, and I was born and raised here, and North St. Louis has not been invested in several different ways in decades, and that was by design. There were reports written back in the 80s that strictly said that we will not invest in North St. Louis and will let it shrivel up and die. And North St. Louis, and because we have not invested in North St. Louis, which is also where a majority of Black people live, we've seen it decline over the years. There's very little industry. There are bank deserts and food deserts, no healthy food options. And so we need to make sure that our investment in North St. Louis is intentional. And when I say, investing in North St. Louis, it doesn't mean that we can't walk and chew gum at the same time. We can invest in places that haven't been invested in decades, and also continue investing in other parts of the city that don't need as much help. But in my opinion, North St. Louis is in crisis mode and needs someone to invest not only in opportunity, but in brick and mortar housing, affordable housing, commercial industry, making sure that there are jobs here for people who live here, and a whole host of other things to start to see its rebirth.
So another way that mayors across the country have proposed to alleviate economic security for so many people is to provide folks with a basic income program. And over 3 dozen mayors across the country have publicly signed on to a coalition called Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, with experts believing that stability for vulnerable populations during times of transition would decrease the risk of people becoming homeless, incarcerated, or experiencing other really harmful outcomes. So would you as mayor support a basic income program and use your position as the city's mayor to raise public and philanthropic dollars to get basic income programs started in St. Louis?
Yes, I've been following universal basic income as a policy for several years now, and I'm good friends with the former mayor of Stockton, Michael Tubbs, and have been actively watching how his pilot program is working. And one of the things that my dad and I always say is that there aren't too many problems that money won't fix. And this is one of them. However, Missouri has some constitutional requirements or prohibitions that prohibit us from just giving people money outright. So we would have to find some workarounds in order to do that here in Missouri. But I would definitely support adding St. Louis to that list and finding ways to be able to participate. And might I also add that one of the biggest philanthropic gifts to Mayors for AGI was from Jack Dorsey, who's a St. Louis native. So I feel like that would be good for him that his hometown is finally on board.
So this is actually my last question this time. Thank you for bearing with me. So what's one specific thing that you plan to do that your predecessor did not do in order to make city government more transparent and more accessible for the people it serves?
So I plan to do a top to bottom review of how we do everything in St. Louis or in our government. I did the same thing when I took over the treasurer's office and found out where the needs were and brought in the people and or resources to tackle that. I feel like a leader is only as good as the team that she puts around herself. And so I am committed to surrounding myself with smart people who are ready to roll their sleeves up and ready to make our government work for the people who pay taxes for government to work for them, because it should work for you, not the other way around.
Treasurer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, St. Louis voters, don't forget, the runoff is on Tuesday, March 2nd. That's one important date. The next one is the general election, which is on Tuesday, April 6th. And especially important, the last day to register to vote in the general election is on March 10th. Now, that's all the time we have for today. Continue to follow us on The Appeal Live by following us on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.